This is Jessica K. Parker, the author of Teaching Tech Savvy Kids. And can you introduce yourself briefly, other than the author of that book, Jessica?
Sure thing. Hi, I'm Jessica Parker. I live in Oakland, California, and I'm actually an assistant professor at Sonoma State University, a California State University up north, about an hour away. I teach in the School of Education department there, and not only do I teach pre-service teachers, so teachers that are getting their credential in secondary education, but I also teach master's students who are teachers who've been in the field anywhere from 3 to 20 years who want to come back and get an emphasis in curriculum and teaching, specifically looking at educational technology. So I'm lucky, and I would say fortunate, to be able to work with teachers before they get their credential, and then after they've been in the field to come back and say, okay, let's talk about your interests and your topics, and let's take it farther. So that's me.
So you pose three big questions at the beginning of your book, and you get back to them at the end. I think it would be helpful to frame our discussion if you could briefly talk a little bit about what does learning look like in the 21st century, what does literacy look like in the 21st century, and what does knowledge look like in the 21st century?
Yeah, thanks for asking me that. I mean, those questions obviously don't have one single correct answer, and that's kind of the point of those questions, is really to say, okay, let's stop for a second, let's take a step back and look at this from a philosophical perspective. And so when we look at learning and literacy, rather than specifically looking at school-based literacy or school-based learning, we can start to see what's happened in the 21st century in terms of opening up online spaces, online communities, online networks that really allow kids to engage in this kind of creative, dynamic, multifaceted learning process that we don't necessarily see within school. And so as an educator and also a learner, I feel like it's important for us to try to really ask ourselves, what is school-based learning? What is school-based literacy? And in my opinion, it's pretty confined. It's pretty static. In my opinion, talking to the teachers I currently work with, it's the same definition when I was a kid in elementary school as it is currently. And so that's not really necessarily how literacy is in general. It's ongoing, it's changing, it's dynamic, and same with learning. And so I think there's a great way that if we look at these questions, ask ourselves to really critique it, revise it, rethink it, that this will inform our practice. And that's really the point. The point isn't to insert technology. I mean, that's not what I'm suggesting or promoting. I mean, the point is to create better teaching and learning environments. And it's through the actual discussion of what does learning look like? What does literacy look like? What does knowledge look like, especially when it comes to Wikipedia in a mediated culture, is how we as educators can not only improve our own classrooms, but improve our own practice. And so I think that's a great starting point. Is there a right answer? No. Is this going to be an easy process? No. It's probably going to be a long discussion, but that's exactly what we need. We need to start discussing these big philosophical issues in order to be able to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do in my English classroom. I think too much of the time, and I find myself with this too, especially when I taught secondary, we get stuck kind of in our curriculum, in our content, working on specific units, and we don't have a chance to really step back and say, you know what, let me turn off the treadmill for a second. I've been running from August to June, and now let me really reflect on what it is I'm doing as an educator, because literacy and learning have really changed. In our culture and the way we engage with text, the way we create text. And so I think it's really beneficial for us to step back and say, what does learning look like? What do I see students doing now, both in and out of school? And if we can take initiative within our schools, within our own classrooms, within our districts, and say, you know what, let's broaden the notion of school-based literacy. Let's try to broaden the notion of school-based learning. I think not only will we be able to create better teaching and learning environments, but we'll be more engaged and motivated. Our students will be more engaged and motivated, and we will also have created a community of learners rather than a teacher with one correct answer. So that's my short answer to a very long discussion, hopefully.
Well, of course, your book is really aimed at K-12 teachers. My experience teaching college students has been that there's a particular interconnection between these issues, in that knowledge used to be pretty much based on books in libraries and pretty much trustworthy. And now there's an enormous amount of knowledge that's online, in the web. And I don't think that that is going to go away. It's increasingly where people look to get knowledge, but of course that knowledge is much less trustworthy. Getting a book out of the library and doing a search on the web require somewhat different skills in order for the user of that information know whether it's useful or even bogus information. And because of that change in the certainty about knowledge, literacy ought to include a lot more of the kind of critical inquiry into what is this all about that maybe was not as necessary in library book-based era, although I think it's always important to teach some kind of critical thinking, and that learning therefore ought to have more to do with the students making inquiry rather than being very good at absorbing what the teacher tells them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not sure I agree with the word trustworthy. I think that if I went and picked a book out of the library, that I'm not sure that I would automatically trust it. I think your goal as a researcher, whether you're in third grade doing a certain project or you're in college completing your dissertation, is really to evaluate your sources, whatever they might be. And especially, I mean, you brought up the point in terms of the internet and getting something off of a wiki or something online, it could be bogus. But then again, research in general and trying to evaluate and assess sources is really about trying to understand what are they saying and do I agree or disagree with this? And like you said, being critical of the source itself. So I do think that we need to teach these skills, and I think we are teaching them, but I do think that we need to apply them across the perspective, across the in general. And what I think needs to happen is that we look at text in terms of perspective, in terms of who wrote this book, what is the content here? Can we talk about objectivity and subjectivity? Is objectivity even something one can attain? What about bias? I mean, I would argue that a history textbook shouldn't be deemed trustworthy just because it's a history textbook. They've made certain choices around what to include, what to exclude, and so there's certain things that we need to not take for granted because we see it in a printed book. Just like my book, for instance, I wouldn't want teachers to say, oh, it's published, therefore it's true. I don't present this as the truth. I present this as something in which we have a dialogue, in which educators are really going to grapple with this and assess, okay, am I going to trust Jessica and her sources? And so that's something I think we need to be doing with every single text. And it would be nice to think that there was a time, whenever that was, that books were trustworthy. But in fact, there's always been perspectives and there's always been bias. And so I think those are issues that we really need to talk about, not only in the classroom, but also from administration point of view in terms of purchasing textbooks and et cetera, but making this a conscious effort across the curriculum to analyze perspective within text, whether they're written, whether they're multimodal in terms of video, whether it's just the billboard outside on the street or the billboard that goes by on the bus. And so I think that's kind of the perspective I want teachers to take rather than an either-or perspective of, well, books were great and they were trustworthy, now we have this Wikipedia and they're not. If we start from that perspective of either or, we kind of get stuck and there's no room to try to figure out, well, what's really going on here in terms of credibility, in terms of evaluation, in terms of literacy today. And so that's, it's not an easy question and it's not an easy answer. And I think it's going to take a lot of discussion in order to figure out how do we promote this within classrooms without taking an either-or stance.
Well,
yeah.
You mentioned administrators. I think one of the most important dialogues going on today is between educators and administrators, between teachers and their principals. Anything that you can say that can help teachers who are enthusiastic about 21st century approaches to literacy, learning, and knowledge, how can they convince their administrators that what are sometimes called new media skills are even necessary in the classroom today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Luckily, I've had some experience with that over the past year, working with in-service teachers who have actually implemented blogs in the classrooms or in their classrooms or implemented wikis or implemented chat function in a math classroom after school. And what those teachers did is not only did they try to collaborate with their other colleagues, but they also said after the fact and after they got approval, they said, look, this is what I've done. And here's my evidence for why I think this became a better teaching and learning environment. And they allowed the students to speak for themselves. And so they would bring in student work and bring in examples and say, look what's happening. Come to my classroom. I want to invite you in. And then from there, I think teachers, I mean, they're putting themselves out there, and that's tough. I mean, they're saying, okay, I'm going to test this out. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to see how it goes. And I'm going to try, if I think it's successful, I'm going to try to then talk to my administrator and discuss this. But I don't want teachers to think they're alone. I think there's a huge, rich community online where teachers can go to get assistance, to talk about ideas, to talk about ways to work with their administrators rather than against them. I think we're already in a culture in which teachers feel isolated and feel alienated. And so my advice to them would be not only to reach out online, but also reach out to your colleagues, test things out in your classroom, and then be honest and upfront with your administrators. But I would also talk to administrators and say, you know what, you need to read this book just as much as teachers do. You need to rethink what it means to learn and what it means to be literate in this society. And so you need to be supportive of your teachers when they test out new ideas, when they bring in new media, and be there for them and applaud their effort, because we have a school system that isn't really set up to promote risk-taking from a teacher's perspective and potentially, one could argue, a student's perspective. And so I think administrators have to be on board as well. And they're getting there. I really think they're getting there. And I have success stories of teachers coming back and saying, my administrator went for it, and we found a parent that went ahead and donated money. So we've created this open source network for us that's private. And so I think amazing things happen if you can go ahead and try to experiment and try to take a risk. But it's not easy. And so again, I would say arm yourselves with resources, arm yourselves with colleagues, like-minded colleagues, whether they're face-to-face right there in your own district or whether they're in states away. But whatever the case, make sure that you feel like you're supported. I mean, the last thing you want to do as a teacher is to go out on a limb, implement a blog, it works well, and then no one listens. And that's frustrating. That's really frustrating.
The website associated with your book is one resource that will lead to other resources for teachers. And I think, one of the methods that I teach for building personal learning networks is find someone who knows what they're talking about and find who they're talking to and listen to them and bring your issues to them. So a starting point is probably the most important part. Any other resources besides the website for your book that would be good starting points that you would recommend for teachers?
I think within the website, you can also find some of the contributors to the book. There were 28 contributors in the book, and I think they not only do they range from academic researchers, but also classroom teachers and counselors. And many of them have signed up on the social network that we have. So go and talk to them, ask questions. I mean, ask as many questions as you want. This is really about making sure that we improve education in the 21st century. And I think that's a great point, is that they can start somewhere and get people that are like-minded on board and then ask tons of questions. And so one of the resources I would say is go to the website, but then also go and see if one of these contributors resonates with you, and then email them. And they would totally be open for you to email them or email me. I would be totally open for you to email me. And then also see who's linked and then go from there. Do some savvy research and just go to the resources section of the site. And there's tons of links for you to go and check out. Not that I want you to be overwhelmed. I mean, there is a way that with this technological change, it's so easy to feel overwhelmed. And I personally need to take time out away from the computer because it does feel overwhelming. But that's just something you have to learn over time. So those would be a couple starting points for resources.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm confident that this is going to be helpful to teachers out there who are interested in the very issues that you raise in the book.
Great. Thank you so much, Howard.